Good morning, Phoenix, and welcome to the House of Mystery radio show. This is the place to come for true crime, conspiracy, and alternative history. Only on KFNX 1100 Independent Talk Radio. We're here every Saturday morning, 6 to 7 a.m., and I'm your host, Al Warren. You're back in the House of Mystery on KFNX Phoenix, and today we're talking about the groovy world of myth and vampires and all the fun stuff. And joining us, we have an author who's written several encyclopedias on subjects in this matter. And I was just looking at the Encyclopedia of Beasts and Monsters in Myth and Legend Folklore. Joining us is vampirologist and author Theresa Bane. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Wow. So that's quite a subject. How did you get into doing all these encyclopedias on all the myth and the different, I guess I want to say animals or beasts of myth?
Well, I've been an author with McFarlane Publishing Company for some years now. My first book with them was the Encyclopedia of Vampire Mythology in World Religions. And the creature book came about because I do a lot of encyclopedias for them for academia and textbook purposes. And when I finished writing the creature encyclopedia, it was a lot larger than I had originally thought it would be. It was about the size of the first 4.5 Harry Potter books, if it had gone to print like that. So the publisher had thought we would break up the book into 3 different encyclopedias, one of mythological creatures, and then one of ghosts and humanoid beings, and then a third book of spirits and entities in that sort of category. So that's how the Encyclopedia of Mythological Creatures came about. I accidentally wrote 3 books at once and didn't realize it.
Well, and so now, first of all, where did you find all the information? So you go out there and kind of do a lot of reading, research, talk to people. What does it take to write a book about demons or fairies or ghosts like this?
It takes a lot of time, a lot of time. How I did it was many years ago, back in 2005, I had the idea for the Vampire Encyclopedia, and so I started reading books. I just started with someone else's book of vampires and found a lot of the information was very repetitive, so I started looking into the individual entities, and as I did, I broadened out from what I call, just that type of, it sometimes appears in the humor section in bookstores, these type of vampire books. But then from there, I went on to sociology books, anthropology books, religious texts. And as I came across a vampire, I would make notes on it. And I was doing this on paper at the time. But also as I found other mythological creatures in these various cultures and religions, I would make notes of those and I would put them all in different shoe boxes and file folders. And eventually, I just had a lot of boxes and a lot of file folders of individual scraps of paper of individual creatures and angels and demons and fairies. And while I was writing one book, I was also writing 7 other books simultaneously, or at least doing the research for it. And then once the research stops, and that's a different addiction, you have to sit down and write your notes out into sentences so they make sense for other people. And so now I'm just at the stage where, with my research, that I just go to my next huge pile of stuff and alphabetize it and write it out logically.
Wow. So when you get to something, let's say we take vampires, for instance. Now, this seems to be in every sort of culture around the world, some sort of vampire being. Now, does that represent that it's the same being and it must be true because it's in every culture, or is it one leads to another, or once the story gets changed and kind of moves from one culture to another?
Well, that's a very, very interesting question. I'll preface it by saying that I myself do not believe in the existence of vampires because of the research I did. There was a point in my life where I would have thought, hey, maybe vampires are real. But now I don't think so much. But the reason that there's vampires in every culture is that there are the same basic human fears in every culture. Even from ancient times, people had the questions of where am I going to sleep? What am I going to eat? Are my children going to be safe? It doesn't matter whether you were living in a cave or whether you're living, in modern times. You still have the same basic questions and fears. The reasons that there's the different species of vampires, and there's a little over 600 different species of vampire, is that different cultures have different priorities. Like in Africa, African vampires are not necessarily beings. They're vampiric witches, and they're magical spells, or they're creatures, but they're not reanimated corpses the way like European vampires are. In the northern parts of the world, like Iceland, Alaska, and henceforth, vampires there, they steal body heat, and they steal fat stores of human fat. Where in other parts of the world, they attack firstborn children, or they cause droughts and plague. So it really depends on the priorities of a culture on what the vampire attacks. Very few vampires are actually blood drinkers when you look at the different species of vampire.
So what made them go to blood, or so to speak, and also, so what is it that they have in common? They're actually draining the culture of what they're scared of most, or?
Yes, whatever a society tends to hold most precious and dear is what vampires attack. It's not so much that vampires go after blood; it's that they go after the blood of, and then insert noun. Lots of Greek vampires go after attractive men, using the guise of a beautiful woman. In tribal countries, vampires tend to go after the firstborn adult male, or the most attractive child, or the parent's favorite child. In other countries, they go after cattle, or it's whatever at the time of the culture created the vampire. It was whatever was the most necessary for that society. And when you know what a culture's vampire is, you know what it attacks, and then you know what that society holds most precious. So it kind of gives you, as an anthropologist, it gives you so much information at a glance about a people. If you know what a culture's vampire is, you already know a lot about them.
And a lot of so Hollywood is probably taking it somewhere totally different, because what we see on TV, and that where they the fangs, the blood sucking, and about the cross. How did religion get into it then? Like a cross would burn the vampire, and garlic they don't like all of those different things, myths, I guess you would say, about how to kill a vampire.
We'll start with the garlic. Just as I was saying, when you know what a people fears, you know that's what the vampire attacks. At the same time, that the societies have also unconsciously given you the same means of what they have the most plentiful stock of. In countries, now garlic is something that grows in every continent of the world except for Antarctica. It's the only place it doesn't grow. You can have rocky soil, moist soil, dry soil. Garlic grows. It's like a weed, but yummy. And so that's why vampires are repelled by it, because if these vampires are going to be such numerous and plentiful creatures, it stands to unconscious reason that you would also have to have a means to defend yourself by it. If there were, for the sake of argument, a vampire that dwelled in shoe stores, I could promise you that if that was a culture and society, the means to ward it off or attack it would be with shoe hints, something that would be found in that environment. That's just a crazy example. Vampires in the cross, and this is how this happens. And I'll preface this by saying I am a Roman Catholic and I do believe in God, so nobody send me hate mail about this. But this is how this goes. The Roman Catholic Church, for broad or ill, was very conquest-minded at one time in its history. And whenever it would move into an area and save people, as it were, from themselves and their religion and their heathen gods, what have you, the first thing they would do is they would say, tell us about your all evil dude. And they would, and they'd say, fantastic, our religion has the same evil dude. We just call him by a different name. And we just call your God by a different name. So your religion is our religion, but ours is the supersized version of it. So here are some holy relics and icons from our church that you can use to repel your demons, because they're now demons. We're not calling them gods anymore because we're more right than you. Not that you're wrong, but we're just more right. And if you insist on pretending you're right, then we're going to, do terrible things to you. And that's just history. So, but that's how crucifixes and other holy items came to affect vampires. Normally they did not, and that was the church's influence. That's how the church conquered the world. They would move into a place, do a little anthropological research, find out what people liked, what they were afraid of, coded the religion over it, and said, here's how you repel your monsters. And that's it.
And how about the natural enemy of a vampire? So we're told by, again, Hollywood, that the werewolf is the natural enemy and that they're fighting. Is that kind of true, too, or...?
No, that is a complete Hollywood thing. In all my research, I've never found any instances of vampires and werewolves confronting one another. It just doesn't happen mythologically or in historical record of it, but it does make for some fantastic film. The closest thing that I found, and it was only in one pamphlet that was published in like a 15-somethings, where a vampiric cult, and that's magic users who use blood in their magic, they would drink blood and they would transform themselves spiritually onto the plains of Jehoshaphat. And I don't know where it is, so nobody email me that either. And they were of course evil because they were blood drinkers. But fortunately in the same community, there were a group of good witches who could take on the form of wolves, and they would, through their good magic, turn into wolves and werewolf-like creatures and also go to the plains of Jehoshaphat. And on this astral plane, these two armies would meet and they would do battle. And if the vampire cult won, then there would be plague and famine and the king would be an idiot and increase taxes and all kinds of horrors would befall the community. But if the wolves and werewolves won, then everything would be groovy for another season. And this was that society's way of coping for why are things going so good, why are things always seem to go bad one after another.
Well, that's interesting. Now, the modern-day vampires and tend to be more, it's a lot more drama to it, and, it's all that sort of stuff. How does that affect, there's actual people out there in the world that think they're vampires and want to drink blood and stuff, and that. Is this something that's always happened? There's been people that have followed these vampires?
New phenomena, and I use new in the sense of the word that vampires have been around since the beginning of time. The vampire as something that humans empathize with or strive to become or want to pretend to be or have become fans of in both fiction and movies is very, very new. We'll say the last 100 years, maybe 120 years. What's most fascinating about the vampire is of all the mythological creatures, it's the one most like us, because at some time in its existence, it was one of us. And it's more in this modern era, I think, and this is just my personal opinion, looking at society from an anthropological point of view. Of course, is as technology has increased, people's connection to the vampire has also increased. It started off, I guess, in the Industrial Revolution. It's sort of like now, if you look around, people are always looking into their phones, their iPhones or their whatevers, and they're not connecting on a face-to-face. They're putting in a lot of video time or a lot of media time, but they're not actually sitting down as a community anymore. There are no more town halls. There aren't book clubs. There aren't people talking at bus stops the way people used to. But now everyone is alone in a room. You know, you can have 100 people sitting in a cyber cafe. Nobody's looking up. Nobody's talking. They're all very absorbed in what they're doing. And we're sort of giving ourselves permission for a sense of self-imposed isolation. And in that sense, we're connecting to the vampire because here's this immortal creature, all alone, a stranger in a strange land, and it has no means of connecting. And people sort of gravitate to that. And I think that's why the vampire in fiction, movies like Twilight and the originals and, you know, even Buffy the Vampire Slayer, I think it's why people sort of gravitate to that sort of stuff. They can connect to the vampire. You can go, oh, I get you. I'm also sad and lonely and mopey. I also don't feel love or connecting to society. Let's be lonely for eternity together. Yeah. And they always cast cute guys for them. So.
Yeah. Well, you got to have the look, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, I was also, you know, I was thinking with zombies and vampires and all of the Walking Dead and True Blood and all that. You know, a psychologist told me it was more about how you're saying the phone bit, how we're looking into the phones and not connecting, and that zombies and vampires are more about we're really walking around soulless.
Yeah.
That's sort of what it's not so much that we're looking at, like, because I always thought it was maybe we're always looking for that tragedy, the end of the world. It's all doom and gloom. But she was saying that no, it's more about that our connection with each other and how we're fighting off the soulless.
Exactly. I couldn't agree with her more. That's exactly what Walking Dead's about. It's a TV show that I periodically both love and hate. I love it because it's good storytelling and it's fairly decent characterization. But I don't like it because in that sort of world, zombies would really only exist for a year. Because I know, especially in Atlanta, there ain't no corpse, anything lasting more than a couple of weeks in the summertime of Atlanta. That's just it. And you'd know where the horde is because of the blowflies. But that withstanding, she's absolutely right. The idea of roaming the countryside, a small group of people huddled together for a mutual comfort and attacking off the waving horde of the soulless damned is sort of what it's like to live in a large city or even in a small town. You're all alone, and the few friends that you have, you stick very close with. You clip mittens and do as much as you can together because it's so hard to reach out and make a connection. And in part, our technology is to blame.
Yeah, so the zombies are all using cell phones.
Exactly. or you always hear this is my new favorite argument. It's those millennial kids. Yeah. I don't understand them. I don't get them. They're doing their own thing.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not saying being millennial is bad. I'm just saying that's how some people feel. They can't understand or reach out. And so they've just become now part of their zombie horde. Oh,
totally. You know, I was watching, I caught an old movie from the 60s, and the one neighbor was complaining to the other neighbor as she was on the phone, and he couldn't understand how she could talk into a box and not talk personal to people, you know, because he didn't have a phone. Maybe it's sort of similar.
It's pretty much the same thing. It's just people who can and are not willing to make that association or that next connection, and that's why vampires and zombies are so popular right now. It's one subconscious group of people finding comfort in another, whether it's love-hate or it's love-love.
So now, where did it all start? So how did a vampire start? Like, do we know when it started in culture anywhere?
We have a pretty good idea. This information that I'm going to give you was accurate in 2012, which is the last time I really looked into it. According to my 2012 research, the oldest piece of human writing that has been found and correctly carbon dated and whatnot was not a love poem. It wasn't an inventory or a honeydew list. It was a magical spell to ward off vampires from attacking infants. And so that tells you how it's beyond ancient Akkadian. It's just very, very old script. it's amazing it could even be translated as such. So vampires have always been with us. Their appearances have changed, their motives and desires have changed. But whatever it's called, in whatever part of the world, wherever along the timeline, vampires are not your friend. The idea of the fictionalized vampire saying, but I want to join the track team, is complete fiction. A vampire wouldn't ever want to do that.
That's interesting. Where did it come up with the they can't be out in the daylight and the sun?
That's also fiction. Most vampires can. In fact, Greek vampires they reach their power apex at noon outdoors. And I can't think of a hotter place than the Greek islands noon outdoors, except maybe exactly on the equator. It just depends on the people's culture. There are some vampires that are more potent at night or more active at night. But I think that in those cultures, they're more active at night because it's safer for them to get into their devilment and mischief than it is to go walking around. In societies where vampires can walk around in the daylight, they can pass for people. But in societies where vampires are more monstrous or are obviously animated corpse or have horrific aspect, they tend to be nighttime creatures. That doesn't mean they can't come out in the day. It's just, I think that's more of an author creation. It's not even Hollywood. It's literary. For the sake of good storytelling, an author somewhere along the line created that, and it fell into popular use.
Yeah. Draws the line, gives you protection.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so I've noticed that in like your Encyclopedia of Beasts, Monsters, in myth, legend, and folklore, how did you, like, you don't have things like Loch Ness Monster and stuff, so how did you draw the line between what's folklore and legend and what's real? Not saying that it's real.
Right. What I had to do is, there's another McFarland author who wrote an amazing book on cryptozoology. His name escapes me right now, but it's in the intro to my book. He pretty much, as I used his book as a baseline, was if the critter was in his book, give it serious consideration as to whether or not it was mythological or not. The Loch Ness Monster didn't make it in because there's no mythology about the Loch Ness Monsters. There's legends in the sense that there's old folklore, but there's not any religion about it. It was never worshipped as a god. There's no historical precedent for it ever being part of a community or a society or relating to a seasonal anything. It's just an older version of that old haunted house on the hill, or old lady so-and-so is a witch. It's sort of like a regional urban legend that has really taken on a life of its own. I also don't have like the king cheetah, because no one's ever really cited the king cheetah. I don't have a lot of cryptozoological animals in there. And it was hard to decide because you have to make a finite decision and then commit to it. You can't say, yeah, but part of my criteria was, is there a serious, scientific, whether you agree it's scientific or not, research team actively looking for this creature now or in recent times? And if the answer is yes, I didn't include it. There's lots of people looking for Bigfoot. Whether or not I believe in Bigfoot is irrelevant, but there are lots of scientists who are looking for it. People believe Bigfoot could be real. I also didn't include the kangaroos of Texas. I don't think there are kangaroos hopping around Texas, but kangaroos are also real creatures. I could go to a zoo or Australia or lots of places and see a kangaroo, so I didn't include them. And I spell out my criteria on how I made this decision a lot more intelligently in my introduction and preface in the book.
So what tends to be the most popular? And that's use that word as in what's the biggest of the beasts and monsters that you did talk about in your book?
Centaurs are very popular from Greek mythology. There's a lot of centaurs. Dragons are also very popular and ageless. There's a lot more species of unicorn than I ever thought there was before I started writing the book. I think if I could just interject, my favorite entry in the book is one called The Hounds of Actium, just because of how I came about finding it. A lot of the books that I use in my research are written in the mid to late 1800s. And I don't mind using those books so much because mythology is mythology. It's not going to change. Greek myths, we're not going to probably find any new Greek myths. So a book that was written in 1850 is still as accurate as one written today. But the difference is the language of those books are very, very different. And it seems like they do have a lot of lost information in them, because as other researchers use these books or have used those books, they tend to go, yeah, but everybody knows that story. Or this is a very popular story and I can't not use it. And somehow over time, in the last 150 years, the legend of the Hound of Actium just sort of disappeared. And I had never heard of it. I didn't know of any of my research peers who had heard of it. And when I came across it, I was just over the moon. And it tells the story of Actium, who's this Greek youth who came upon a goddess bathing. And he sort of he did the humble brag to his friends about, hey, guess who I saw naked taking a bath. And when the goddess heard, she lost her mind and turned him into a deer in the proximity of his group of hunting dogs. And the dogs went and tore him down. They chased him through the woods, caught him, and ripped him asunder. It was very horrific, but, Greek goddesses have a temper.
Yeah.
But it was this pack of hounds in this myth that would have been lost. I don't know that it was only mentioned in the one book that I found. But it certainly did have other Greek myths in it with other mythological creatures, so it compelled me to believe that this was a legitimate mythology and a legitimate story, and I did find other references to Actium, even though I didn't come across that myth again. So I chose to include it in the book for fear that the myth would be lost, and hopefully other researchers and writers will come across it and be inspired and do something with it.
Now, with Game of Thrones being so popular, the dragon is kind of making a comeback. Do you find it to be a correct kind of portrayal of a dragon, or where did they come from?
Well, dragons tend to be largely an Asian myth. There are some European dragon mythologies, but they're more clearly and better defined in Asia. To be honest, I don't watch Game of Thrones, and I've not read the books. It's not my sort of thing. And what I did see on TV, I didn't care for it. I didn't like it. Now, if people want to email me about that, that's perfectly okay, because that's opinion. But I just can't stand the show. I think the characterization is off. It's not consistent, and I'm just not a fan of it.
Right. Well, so now the dragons, they have the dragon in there and the dragon mother, and they're sort of... So what are dragons in myth?
Well, in Asian myth, dragons are symbolic of the elements, of forces of nature that can't be controlled or manipulated or influenced in any way. And that's what they're symbolic of the royal families also. A lot of royal families use them as their symbols. China, Japan, Korea, Thailand, some places in India, but not really. This is where the dragon myths are far more better fleshed out. They tell you their color, their shape, their length, some of them literally down to the number of scales and the patternization of the scales, how many toes they have, where their dragon bowl is, what kind of pearl. I mean, everything you could ever imagine you'd want to know about a dragon would be in the Asian myths. In Celtic mythology and in European mythology, they're more just large, terrible monsters that live in caves and could kill you, like a bear, but not a bear, but a dragon. Sometimes they're called wyvern, which they get their name off the Wyvern River. But they're really just monsters. They're not intelligent. They don't assist. They don't help. They only ever hinder. Whereas in Asian mythologies, dragons can be called upon for help, and sometimes do, sometimes don't. They're intelligent. They rule kingdoms. They're supposed to be, in some cases, the progenitor of family bloodlines. They're far more interactive with the community, as it were. Sometimes good, sometimes bad, just like people. Not so in Europe. In Europe, they're just monsters. Very good.
I wonder why they were so different.
Well, they're completely different societies. I think if you were to take an ancient Celt and someone from a Japanese court in that same time period and put them in a room, and they somehow both magically spoke the same language, they would have nothing in common. So I don't think it would be so surprising to find out that their dragons would also be different. Their vampires would also be very, very different. They have different priorities, different weather, different socialization, just everything about those two periods in that time are different.
Now I've noticed that you had an encyclopedia on fairies,
Mm-hmm.
and now that must have been a lot of work. And did you watch the True Blood series on HBO?
I watched some of it. There was again, it's kind of twitchy for me to watch a lot of TV because I'm so well versed in the mythology. It truly bothers me when there's very little to no research done. But in True Blood's case, it was just the over the top sex. It's just not my thing. I don't need to see it.
Well, I was thinking about how they represented the main character was a fairy, and just what you thought on that, how accurate.
I did watch that series, that part of it where Suki finds out she has fairy blood, and there are some myths of fairies marrying into and having children with it, with people. That's not that uncommon. That didn't strike me at all as troublesome or off kilter. How they handled it was very different. In instance, and that's fine because that's just artistic license. I don't have a problem when an author takes an idea and fleshes it out and runs with it. There's nothing wrong with that. In that respect, I thought it was very good. But the idea of humans and fairies having children together and it being a generational line is perfectly acceptable.
So what is a fairy then? Where did it come from, and what's the basic concept of a fairy?
Well, fairies, like vampires, have varied origins, and again, depending on the people, how they can interact. Fairies are actually a lot more common with vampires, because wherever you are in the world, whatever a society's view of a fairy is they're always linked to nature. Fairies and nature spirits and ancestral spirits are all kind of the same thing with just a slightly different veneer to it. They very, very closely related to the land, and even to this day in all parts of the United Kingdom, there are what's considered fairy bushes or fairy trees that construction companies will not tear up. Farmers will plow around them, and these trees will be hundreds of years old and still around. And I mean, you can Google this right now and get a list of fairy trees in England. I did when I was doing my research. People don't believe necessarily in fairies, but what if they're wrong? And that's sort of the opinion I have. I don't believe in fairies, but I'm not going to be the one to cut down that tree, because what if I'm wrong?
Yeah, you won't make it on social media then.
That's true.
Now, you've got so many of them, and you've got another encyclopedia on demons in world religions and cultures. That must have been a really difficult one to research. How do you approach religious groups and religion societies and talk to them about demons and creatures?
It's a little hard because you have to first have a relationship with different priests and rabbis and other religious leaders, because you just can't walk up to a priest and say, "Hey, can I talk to you about demons?" Or the same thing with a rabbi. They're going to look at you and nod and think, "Oh, there's a sweet, crazy person." And even when you say, "Oh, I'm an author and I'm doing research for a book," that's not always helpful either. And I can tell you from personal experience, you don't want to put an ad on Craigslist and saying I'm an author looking for help on demon research, because that doesn't turn out well.
No.
But fortunately, by that point, I already had I had some contacts in the field and people who knew I wasn't crazy, that I was a legitimate academic researcher. That's always very, very helpful. And when you approach these religions, or any religion, you have to do it from sort of take a step back. When I was doing the bulk of my research for the demon book, this was the year before. It was right after a lot of terrorist attacks had happened. It was in between 9/11 and what's his name being shot, and the SEAL team going after I forgot his name, the terrorist leader.
Oh, it's Saddam Hussein.
Saddam Hussein, thank you. And it was right around that time, and it was hard because there's a lot of Muslim demons, and whatever, I have some anger about that. I'm an American. The idea of the loss of American blood is terrible, but I have to look at all religions very level-minded. I can't take anything personal, and I have to write fairly about everything. I have to be as honest and unopinionated with Muslimism as I am with Catholicism, or I am with Judaism, or Hinduism, or Confucianism. Any place there was a demon, I had to take it and treat it equally. And it's an oppressive topic. It's not like writing about fun things. You're writing about creatures of evil doing evil things, and you're working on that 6, 10, 12 hours a day, 5 or 6 days a week, for almost a year. And it becomes very oppressive. And it was the most difficult book to write just because of the subject matter and everything that was happening in the world at the time.
How do you find a response to it?
Well, I've sold a lot of copies of it, so yeah, I think it's doing well as a published work.
Any negative feedback?
No, I had one critic didn't like the layout of the book or the cover, but I have no control over that. But I've not received any hate mail about the demon book. I'm happy to say. It's also not a challenge to the audience out there. But but the reviews that I've gotten from like Publishers Weekly and Scholastic Journal, they seem very impressed with it.
What did you find the scariest of the demons?
Oh goodness,
so many, I guess.
There are, and offhand I couldn't say. I think it's just the culmination of the burden of work was at the end of the day. I was very, very happy to be done with it.
Yeah. Yeah, and how do you find the world of Satan then? And did you touch off on that with your demonology?
I did not, because I actually have a contact in the Church of Satan, and he was very, very helpful in steering me towards what books to use for research and all. I'm not a Satanist. I'm not saying join the Church of Satan any more than I'd say join the Methodist Church, but because it's also not for me. But It's a good place to go to if you're looking at demons and doing research, and that's how I found it.
And do you think the portrayal of exorcism is pretty accurate?
Well, I didn't cover exorcism in my book because I didn't want to give what I will define as crazy people hints or ideas. I'm not saying people who do exorcisms are crazy, but I didn't want people who are chemically imbalanced using my book as some sort of perceived how-to guide, which it's not. It's just a list of descriptions, like an Audubon field book of demons, as it were. But exorcism is not anything I'm familiar with beyond the movies on TV. I've never seen one in person. I've had a few dealings with people who claimed to be exorcists, but I wouldn't trust them further than I would throw a piano.
Right.
But those are the individuals that I met. Not necessarily. I don't think I've ever met a true exorcist.
That's amazing. Well, you've done some great work. What's up next for you then?
Sleep. Let's see. I'm beginning to think about seriously sitting down and writing my next encyclopedia, which would be the Encyclopedia of Mythological Items, and that I think is going to have the hardest criteria to define of what falls into the category of mythological item. Obviously, there would be things like Thor's hammer, but there's also the idea of what about the so-called relics of Jesus' teeth, or the Ark of the Covenant. Just because I've never seen the Ark of the Covenant doesn't mean it doesn't exist, because there's a church in someplace in Africa that claims to have possession of it, but you can't see it and you can't go near it, because if you do, you'll die. So if that's true, then the Ark of the Covenant exists and it should not be in my book. But if it's not true, then it needs to be in my book because it's myth. And I'm this is the reason why I haven't done any real work on the Encyclopedia of Items yet, is I'm having a hard time defining what is a mythological item.
Yeah, that'd be a real tough one.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, what's your contact information for everybody if they want to get a hold of you or they have some ideas?
Well, that'd be great. I'm not online a lot because I'm just not online a lot. I spend a lot of time reading and writing. If you want to get in touch with me, Theresa Bane is my Facebook account name. It's Theresa Bane, B-A-N-E. I also have theresabane.net if you want to go to my website, which is, I don't keep up with a lot because I'm not a web designer and I'm not good with technology. But those would be the two places to get in touch with me best. I have a contact the author button on my website, and you can hit me up with any sort of question or invite or whatever you like with on Facebook. Always open to questions, opinions, and cute mins of dogs.
Well, thank you very much for taking some time and talking to us about these are really, really interesting subjects. And your latest book, I guess it's the Encyclopedia of Beasts and Monsters in Myth and Legend Folklore, right?
Actually, that one I had 3 books come out this year. My newest book. Yeah, I know. I had a book come out since I originally spoke to you, is the Encyclopedia of Ghosts and Humanoids.
Wow.
Giants and humanoids, I'm sorry. And it covers giants and humanoids, as the title would imply, like Valkyrie and Andir and that sort of stuff.
Wow. Really interesting subjects. And, wow. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been fun.
The mission has been completed.
The end! By George, he's got it! It is the end! I'll say it.
This has been a production of the Z-Talk Radio Network.
If you're lying to me, I'll be back.